each other, and that's how I found Jim Bishop. So
that is true.
all right. Christine's on. Hi, Ben. So we are at the top of the hour and we're going to go ahead and start. Welcome to the last Coffee and Careers of the academic 2021 year. And so I didn't have anybody vote on what they wanted to hear about or what's next, but a lot of things that came up was leadership, Jim, and that's kind of where I thought when I was introduced through Jim Smith to Jim Bishop, I thought you would be perfect to talk to our group, and we are honored to have you. So thank you for being with us. And we will be, so to get started, I'm going to say, if I get this right, the conjunction leader, Jim Bishop, has formed his own company, and this because he's got 15 years of experience in corporate leadership and human performance. He's coached teams of employees across the globe, not only for animals, but also human health when he's worked primarily at Elanco and Eli Lilly. In the past, he was similar to us as a technical service lead in PIC, and he also worked for the National FFA Foundation in his career. But he's seen a need of social unrest and hyper-political polarization in the global pandemic. He recognized leaders are sacrificing their true leadership on the altar of efficiency. And so they became reactive to stress and change. And they framed decisions on sparse information and created either or scenarios with extreme opposites. And the true casualties were people and organizations who time crisis needed to find connection, but instead found more division and polarization. So realizing that the world was crying out for a different leader, one which he could unite tribes and build unity in the midst of ambiguity, the and of both leadership framework was born, and Jim formed Conjunction Leadership. So thank you, Jim, and I will stop sharing because I think you have some slides, and I think I need to give you access. Nope, you should be allowed to share your screen.
I think I should. Tell me if you're able to see that, Casey.
Yep, we are good to go.
Perfect. Well, that was quite an introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for introducing me. And then thank you for your attention today. So most of what Casey said is absolutely true. Today, I'm going to take you through a journey of a little bit about how this pig guy who learned how to AI sows back in the early 90s became a guy who helps leaders and teams function at their highest performance today and find their best leadership self. So I thought probably if I were to put myself in your situation and start thinking about what does career and life look like, some of the reflections that I've had on leadership over the years might be helpful. So today, we'll just dive into a little bit of that. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat. Casey, if you can help me kind of monitor those, and then Casey's agreed to interrupt as needed if we need to pause. And I want this to be really a dialogue as well. So a little bit, I'll just share with you about myself. I live here in Central Indiana. My wife also was a Purdue graduate. We have 5 kids, age ranges from 17 to 9. So that's where I've learned most of my leadership practice, not only in the work environment, but the home environment. We're an active 4-H family. I hail from a family farm in northern Indiana. And I'm actively involved in several activities and organizations here with our Ag Leadership Program, our Extension Board, a program called Edge Mentoring, which is for young professionals, and our County Farm Bureau as well. Casey gave you a little bit about my professional background. My master's degree actually is in behavior and physiology. My master's thesis is actually in adult male swine, pleasure and frustration correlates in adult male swine. I can go into that more, but all that to say, my first job out of college was to be a technical service rep for PIC back in the early days of AI and boar studs coming together and figuring out how do we ship semen across the country in different ways and get it to the sow farms. I went from there to a company called Agribusiness Group, which was a consulting organization in agriculture, primarily in leadership and agricultural programming and development. So Learned a lot about the human mind, adult education, and the background of how to get learning into people and help them achieve their outcomes. Moved from there to the National FFA Foundation, where I had a chance to raise money for the student-led programs of FFA. And then the bulk of my career, as Casey mentioned, has been with Elanco in the animal health business, and then ultimately a few years with Lilly in the parent organization at that time of Elanco in human pharmaceuticals and specifically in oncology. The last year, it was just in the end of 2020 when the world was really still trying to figure out what it wanted to be in this pandemic, that I saw a need to kind of step away from that and step into what I've always felt like was my best calling, and helping leaders grow, helping leaders step into their power, and just helping leaders figure out how to navigate these tumultuous times. I am doing consulting work right now too with a company called Roche Diagnostics here in Indianapolis as we try to upend their culture and change their leadership model as well to meet the more aggressive demands of the day. So I mentioned, and Casey mentioned as well, the name of my company was, I named it Conjunction Leadership. So I wanted to take you through a little bit of my journey and how I discovered my conjunctions and my and, so that maybe I can help paint a picture for what things look like. So early on in my life, I'm a product of a middle child syndrome. I have an older sister and a younger brother. And so those two things always competed. And I always felt like I was in the middle of trying to put the or there. Either I was with my sister or I was with my brother. But I always felt like it was a lot more fun if we all played together. Quickly in school and high school, all the way through youth activities, I was always struggling between pursuing some of the leadership activities and being, a leader or officer in some of the clubs and activities, or pursuing my academics. And I felt like one or the other was always taking priority. So there was a big or there as well. And finally, I figured out putting it together as an and. Moving into college, it was, and many of you are in this situation too, where you're getting degrees and advanced degrees. Many of you have advanced degrees, and those things don't come without some expense. And it was a struggle to say, how do you get the degrees and be debt free? So trying to figure that out, pursued opportunities that I wouldn't have otherwise. I told you a little bit about my background and my education, having the science background and enjoying that, but I also really enjoy working with the people aspect and the organizational development stuff. Early on in college, I quickly realized that while I enjoyed spending my time in the lab and I enjoyed learning about science, I also enjoyed working around the people part of the science as well. Then moving into corporate world, there's always a tension between getting results and meeting the number and creating a culture where employees feel engaged and they can feel they can do their best. Sometimes companies want to put those two things mutually independent of one another. And I believe if you put the and in between there, you'll figure out how to do both of those things. Today's society as well, diversity and inclusion is a big deal. And as we add more diversity into our mix and we try to be a more inclusive environment, that also means sometimes we erode trust because we don't have a lot of similarity that sometimes breeds trust. So there's two tensions there as well. And if we're going to have the kind of society we want, we need to have an inclusive society with a high amount of trust. Coming from my religious background, I always have a tension too between the grace and truth aspect. So putting the and in between those things helped me kind of form who I am and how I believe and what does my faith, how does it influence my being in the world as well. And I illustrate that only to say that you can see that there are competing tensions at all times in your life. And there are probably things that you think are mutually exclusive to one another. And a lot of times leaders will believe that. And if they believe that, they'll either choose one or the other. I think by putting the and in between there, you can choose both. It just means that the both that you choose and the way that you express yourself will probably be different than many other people because this is not a common behavior. So let me take you through kind of what that means and some of the reflections then about not only who I am, but what have I seen leaders and how they lead today. So it's no surprise that today we have more generations working side by side than we've ever had. And depending where you're at and what industry you're in, I mean, particularly in agriculture, we still have a lot of traditionalists that are involved with the industry today. We also have a lot of Gen Z that are there. You can see kind of the bubbles and see how that represents. But what that means is we have a lot of different ideologies and a lot of different beliefs about how should society function, what does good look like, what does leadership look like, and how does it mean that you behave in this environment. So as we go through those different eras, we can see that there were different points in time in our culture where different things were important. So let me take you through that journey just a little bit. That industrial era, right? Where it was really about building things, heavy things, building bridges and roads and infrastructure, railroads, getting things from one place to another, right? Into the machine age, where it was about taking that infrastructure and making it operate just a little more efficiently. Sometimes it was around the assembly lines and the factory lines where we're trying to push things through a little bit faster. Taking that then and saying on top of it, we're generating a lot of information, and mechanization as well as computerization came into place. So we have a lot of information. What do we do with that information into the digital age, where it was the explosion of information and the assimilation and some of the work behind trying to figure out what not only does it mean, but what will it mean in the future, to the predictive phase. And now into the environment of what we call VUCA, or volatile, uncertain, changing, and ambiguous, right? There's no better example of that than what has happened to our society in the last 14 months. No one could have anticipated what happened. No one could anticipate how to show up in it, and no one knows exactly how to get us out of it. But together, this volatile, unchanging, volatile, uncertain, and changing and ambiguous environment means we just need to show up differently. But if I take you through that journey of what was going on in our culture, I can also take you and I'd help you understand the changing definition of leadership. So back in the industrial and mechanization age, the command and control mindset was really what leadership was about, where information was somewhat scarce. There were only a few people who had access to it, and those people might also be the only ones that had access to either education or sometimes organizational structure, where everyone else was working. They were an employee. So the command and control mindset was the leader tells the individual what to do. And I became a leader mostly because I could assimilate information and I could process it, and then I could send out memos or directives to let other people know what to do. But as we move through that information and digital age into this volatile, changing, and uncertain environment, what that really means is the definition of leadership today is really around much more around coaching and catalyzing, which means I don't need to be the expert on a lot of stuff, but I can be an expert on how to help people get to their outcomes, because the world is changing too quickly for the leader to cascade down decisions. And those decisions often get changed, or the environment gets changed before those decisions get enacted. So what needs to happen is, if I can help coach you to independence or self-reliance, what that will mean is you'll be able to make decisions with your own empowerment. And really, honestly, that's the kind of culture that most people prefer to work in anyway. So what that means and how you see that in the workplace today, the artifacts of yesteryear, if you will, the language that you might hear a lot is people referring to people as my boss or my direct reports, with a strong sense of ownership on their positional power. The systems and structure that are in place were high evaluation systems, marking whether or not the employee did their work, time management systems, and performance management systems, where someone set the goal and someone else was responsible for making the goal happen. Hierarchy and structures and a lot of governance reviews are also the artifacts of yesteryear culture. In the world of assimilation or education, how employees join the workforce, right? There used to be a lot of didactic or formal education, though an employee onboarding program and an employee training program, a lot of modules that might be assigned to somebody for them to learn their work. That doesn't happen so much anymore today, and I'll allude to that in just a minute. And then in terms of rewards or recognition, it was usually around how did someone attain knowledge, because knowledge was power. Information that I could gain knowledge, and the more knowledge I had, the more power I had. Leaders were often rewarded as well for being able to make hard and fast decisions, meaning that when the information got assembled, I would tell you what to do and you would go do that. That would mean I would be I would be rewarded as a better leader. But if we look into the environment of today, and really what's going on, there's a lot more language out there around tribes or teammates. Self-directed work teams are really a big issue, where we need leadership within the team. We don't need positional leadership to tell us what to do. In the systems and the structure, there's a lot more methodologies out there around the agile methodology, which is around pushing decisions down, small self-directed work groups, figuring out what is the vision and how do we get there, but not a lot of direction on what do you need to do day to day. In terms of the structures, a lot of it has been decentralized, and the lean principles are around 80-20. So for those of us that have come from a scientific background, we are usually not comfortable saying we're 80% correct. We want to know that the p-value lines up. But in today's especially corporate environment, the 80-20 rule is really holding place, where we don't have time to get it to the 100% anymore. If it's 80%, what we want to do is launch a minimal viable project and iterate off of that each successive time. In terms of assimilation or education, in the way employees are brought into the workforce today, there's a lot more on-the-job training, which means you're going to go, you'll launch right into the work and you'll be training right along with it. But in terms of the heavy didactic formal education, it doesn't mean it's there so much. So a leader has to be able to identify, what do I need in order for me to get to those outcomes? And then what's being rewarded in our leadership today is a lot more around servant leadership, which doesn't mean just pouring yourself out gratuitously for everybody. But what it does mean is that if we're able to help each other grow and learn, regardless of hierarchy or position, we're much more able to help each other in that process rather than the leader telling everyone what to do. And the goal here today is that leaders will develop other leaders, building the culture of leadership within an organization. So I spend a fair bit of my time in one-on-one coaching sessions with leaders. And I just wanted to paint a picture too of what are some of the challenges that most people are struggling with today, as I kind of draw learnings out of that. If I look at one thing, is I call it infobesity. It's really a term meaning it's consuming large amounts of information, especially when this has a negative effect on a person's well-being or ability to concentrate. There's just so much information out there today that most leaders are bloated on it. They know that they're there, they're reading blogs and journal articles and reading tech mags and tech pubs, but oftentimes they just don't know what to do with it. There's also change saturation going on out there today with leadership, where things have changed so fast and so much that we can't get over one change before we're already in another one. And that pretty much means that we're facing a lot of burnout issues when people don't know how to manage that. Top that off with all the societal shifts that are going on today. So you hear these as the hashtag movements. You see these on the news. You see these as the way that we're approaching the structure of our teams, to the way that we're showing up in society, and the moral causes that certain organizations might be taking on as part of their overall philanthropy, but even more broadly than that, their overall approach and identity in the marketplace. Top that off with all the political instability that we're facing, not only in the US, but really around the world, as people rise up and try to make their voice heard. And if you were to take on top of that, most people, just coming out of looking at some of the most conservative data, are making approximately 35,000 decisions a day. That includes what to eat for lunch, what to wear, but also what to do in their business environment or with their careers. And then macroscopically, no matter what is happening today, we all must face that there's a thing called technical obsolescence, which means in the past, someone used to have an idea and they thought it was a great idea. You would file patent protection for exclusivity on that idea. But today, because of information and innovation and the way things are moving so quickly, your product will probably be technically obsolete before your patent runs out. So this push to innovate, push to drive, push to get more newer, better, faster, smarter, cheaper is constantly there, because the next guy's nipping at your heels. And when you take that all and put that into one person and they're dealing with that plus other stuff, you can imagine that it's very difficult for someone to realize how to show up in today's environment. So how do leaders deal with that? There's a psychological element called splitting. And psychological splitting is known as the all or nothing, or the black and white mindset, where I've got so much information in my head and at my fingertips, and I'm dealing with so much stuff, and I'm on such an element of burnout, I don't even know how to process that. So the way the brain functions is to put that into seemingly opposite categories. It's the most extreme. It's either this or it's this. And you'll hear people say this all the time. In the moment of crisis or in the moment of decision, they'll frame their decision as an either or. Either we go this way or we go this way. And what is the danger of that? Is if they put the wrong conjunction between those things and they frame it as an either or, those are the only options that are available. Those are the only things that people see. The real danger of a leader thinking this way is they can create a culture of all or nothing thinking, where people in their organization only see the extremes. If we listen to the news at night, you may feel that there are only opposite extremes, and you may see those as either or decisions. what the single biggest shortcut here, the single biggest help aid for most leaders is to be able to pause and sit down and say, those are not the only decisions. Let me, there we go. So what is the consequence if you don't choose the right conjunction, right? If you choose the or, you see those as absolutes only. You may also see people as only good or bad. You may have a lot of intolerance to other people's views or opinions because your brain is saying, I don't have the mind space or the capacity to think of any other options than the ones that I already know. There's a lot of forming of factions and divisions in that case when a leader has the or mindset, because they're creating a culture where other people say, I either have to join this or I have to join this. There's an obsession with people wanting to fit in rather than having a feeling of standing out, because they're feeling like they're being left out if they're not in one of those seemingly opposite camps. There's a lot more reactive behaviors in that regard then, because as we start bickering and fighting about the and or about the or, then there's a lot more self-protection, there's a lot more withdrawal, there's a lot more sabotage. And those certainly don't sound like things that would help people get to their outcomes a lot faster. And most probably dangerously for our businesses or even for our own personal leadership is there's a lack of innovation and breakthrough when we have that kind of thinking. Let me illustrate it with a story of a leader that I was working with once in a coaching session, and he came pretty exhausted to the session. When we were inquiring about what was going on in his environment, he was using the biblical example, and he just kept saying, I'm tired of splitting the baby. I'm really just tired of splitting the baby. And when I asked him what that meant to him, what he was saying was every time that people brought him a problem, his brain formed it as we either do this or we do this. And then even sometimes people would bring him those seemingly opposite experiences. But with the definition of a strong leader makes hard and quick decisions, and that's how he's been rewarded, he always had in the back of his mind that it was his job to split the baby. And what that meant was either half of the, or he may be able to decide, but it may be a 51-49 split, but there were about half of the organization who was never happy with his decision. But that was wearing on him because one, his belief was he had to make the decision. He wasn't being a servant leader and helping people make their own decisions. Secondly, it was wearing on him because he realized he didn't have the right conjunction. When I asked him, what happens if you would replace that or with an and? All of a sudden he was able to get to new and different outcomes, because what he could see is these two opposite things weren't opposite, and there were third alternatives that hadn't already emerged. So with that kind of thinking, he was able to go back and repurpose himself in a leadership capacity to help other people replace their or, help them think their decisions through, and eventually got himself out of having to split the baby all the time. So the question that I just asked right now is, what conjunction are you adding, right? Are you adding your ors because the world is moving so quickly? Or are you adding your ands? Are you looking at it going, I would love to do that, but I don't have time. I would love to do that, but I don't have money. I would like to be like this. I would like to show up like that, but right? I would challenge you to say the 3-step process of disrupt, bridge, and grow really is what's going to help you decide how to find that conjunction. Disruption is really a period of unlearning more than it's a period of learning. It's a period of getting comfortable with the things that you are not comfortable with today. It's a period of stepping into a lot of difference and understanding someone else's opinion or perspective, not necessarily adopting it as your own, but just being able to get to a point of saying there are more variations out there than what I currently saw today. There are more news channels to watch than the one I'm preferring to watch today. There are more opinions in the marketplace than the ones that I would naturally hear on my own. And most dangerously, if we scroll our social media feeds and the algorithms push us more of what we want and less of what the other side of the opinion is, the more likelihood is that we're getting into our own situation. So the period of disruption is probably the biggest one for most people. The period of bridging then is really just about saying, how do I get between those two things? How do I make sense of being the older child, or between my younger brother and my older sister? How do I make sense of the social unrest that's going on today when I have one opinion and other people have other opinions? Or more importantly, how do I make sense of what our company needs to do or my business needs to do because I have this idea or this idea? And sometimes it's putting the and to say it can be both. And then ultimately, once you're able to do that, it's just getting to a new period of growth in yourself and getting comfortable with that and developing muscle memory where someone is able to repeat that behavior rather autonomically without having to think about it all the time. So the piece that really empowered me to step away from my corporate world and to start stepping into this was when I could see this process working with new individuals one-on-one, helping them in coaching sessions, figure out what are the things that they need to get uncomfortable with and disrupt themselves, figuring out what conjunctions they could get to, and then figuring out how to develop that muscle memory long-term, not only for the individual, but for the team and ultimately for organizations who choose to build a culture of this as well. But most broadly, I think it's really important for people in the place of figuring out what do careers look like in the future to know what's going on in this macro environment of leadership today, because it's not the leadership of yesterday that we're going to need that's going to get us to tomorrow. It's the leadership of tomorrow that's going to get us to tomorrow, and people who can constantly innovate, not the science. The science will innovate itself with the right people, but it's the people, the system of how we do that needs to change to get us to the new things that we need to do tomorrow. So I'll turn it over to a Q&A at this point and just leave it with the question, what conjunction will you choose? I put my information up there, and so please feel free to call me, send me an email, any questions that you have, and we can address them at this point too, Casey, if you want to moderate that kind of conversation. So.
Yeah, I think I have a good question because we don't have anything yet in the chat feature. So remember, no questions. I'm going to start calling on people and getting you outside of your comfort zones. But a lot of these students in their first jobs leaving, or young professionals, a term that comes up a lot, or I've used, is leading without authority. And what advice do you have? Because I think we're still in agriculture in our industry a little bit, from the old leadership style to the new leadership style. How do you, or advice that you would have for young professionals dealing with that, and what do they need to focus on? Because I think the new leader is really leading without authority.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is, at least my observation would be, it is true in agriculture. It is true in a lot of industrial organizations as well, but that we probably aren't as far along in terms of that catalyzing coach leadership model as some other industries are. But when I hear someone say that, like, what does it mean to lead without authority? What I really hear them asking is, I don't have the positional power to just tell people what to do, right? And while that may be true, it's also archaic, because if you believe that the world is actually changing, and if you believe that most people have a voice and most people have an opinion and an understanding of what is best for them, then you bring that voice to the table in a catalyzing coach fashion, right? So we can think about maybe leadership in multiple levels. At the very, very first level, you lead out of your position. And no matter where you're at, you've been given a position. I mean, you have a title just by virtue of being. You are a student, or maybe you're an associate in the organization. But that also means that they hired you, or that you have some purpose to do that work. And so live within your boundaries and be a leader. And what that means is you don't need to tell people what to do, but you do need to be looking for problems that are solvable. You need to be using your brain and figuring out how to do it. And you need to be making recommendations on how to go about that, and catalyzing the rest of the organization to see the opportunity or the problem, and bringing people along with you as you do that. At very first, that's positional leadership. But leadership by influence really means that people are choosing to follow you because of the way that you show up. You all can think of a leader who makes good decisions and has a lot of positional leadership and tells people all day long what to do. And that's usually not the kind of leader that people will go to bat for or walk through fire for. That's the kind of leader who gets things done, but it doesn't generate a system of leadership. So I think when you ask that question of how do I lead without authority, I think it means to lead within your positional power that you've been given, and do the things that a leader does of building other leaders and bringing people together to solve problems that we haven't solved before, irrespective of title or position. So
I have a good question here from Noel. When making a mindset shift like this, is it important to let those you work with know you are working on this transitional thinking? And then if so, what is the best conversation to start with?
yeah, Well, first of all, let me acknowledge the fact that I love the fact that they've picked up, the questionnaire has picked up on the fact that this is a mindset shift, right? This isn't necessarily a skill set shift yet. Like, you'll adopt new skills, but I can't get you to adopt new skills until you adopt a new mind. So one, I would just want to compliment and call that out. But yes, I think that in adopting of a new mindset, though, it's important to surround yourself with people who are going to support your leadership journey in this, because some of this mindset stuff is pretty deeply rooted, and most people aren't always aware of how their mindset got formed in the first place. It was a series of small events or the community that you were around, right? So I think it is important to have a accountability partner, if you want to call it that, someone who knows you're working on this and somebody who can help you keep the safe spot to say what you're getting comfortable and uncomfortable with at the same time. Sometimes that's a coach, sometimes that's a peer. What I don't think is always helpful is that you say, hey, I just learned something, and now you tell your entire team or your entire organization that you're going to show up differently, because that doesn't really give yourself a lot of grace. And the phrase that I like to use is, under stress, we all regress, right? So while you may be adopting a new mindset, you're still developing muscle memory. And the more muscle memory you have, the more consistently you're going to show up that way. And so therefore, that's what most people will expect of you. But if you go out and broadcast to everybody like, hey, I'm going to show up differently tomorrow, and yet under stress, you regress and you're showing your bad behaviors occasionally, they're going to look at you and go, well, wait a minute, you just told me that you had this whole thing figured out. So I think it's important that you, with vulnerability, disclose to people that I'm in a process of learning, and there's a lot of things that are challenging me, and I'm purposing to try and learn something different. I think that can be helpful. But I've seen a lot of leaders in a well-meaning spirit of vulnerability stand on a podium in front of their team or their organization and go, gosh, I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't really know where to go, and I hope we figure this out. You can imagine what that might feel like from an organizational perspective if your leader says that publicly, even though what they're really saying is we need to learn new things. Well, they can say we need to learn new things differently without causing the organization to panic. So that's why I'm kind of half in and half out on depending on what you're asking. I think accountability is helpful. I think a spirit of vulnerability is helpful. But over transparency sometimes can really stifle the rest of the organization from feeling safe too. So
We have a good question from Claire. What strategies or recommendations would be most important in a situation where two or more leaders are merging in a group with no clear hierarchical structure or authority, I guess, and that would have diverging ideas of how to do things?
yeah, that's good. And it happens. I alluded to the fact of self-directed work teams. It happens a lot more in today's work environment than I've ever seen that happen, because the splitting the baby phenomenon would have been there a long time ago for leaders to come in and say, okay, cut this out, we're going this direction. Those two people would be at odds with one another regardless. So I think it comes down to emotional intelligence, really, is the simple answer here, is know yourself better than you know anything else. Know what your triggers are, know where you're probably likely going to get tripped up, know what your bias might be. Try to be as growth oriented as possible to learn new things and be open to the feedback of other people. And if really most people are, this is philosophical, but I think most people get at odds because they get locked into their own position and they listen with the intent to respond. They don't listen with the intent to understand. So while we're in conflict, my amygdala, which is generally the part of the brain that is responsible for protection, will overreact, and it will want to protect. And so in that conflict, I'm trying to protect myself by listening, and then I want to win the argument. So I'm listening with an intent to respond with something that's going to convince you about my position. But if I listen with an intent to understand, what's going to happen is I'm going to draw you out more and more and more, and that's going to help the other person feel heard. And the more that someone feels heard, the more opportunity you have to share your toys in the same sandbox, right? So the more likely is the conflict is going to go away. Now, up front, it may seem like you're spending extra time because this is not a behavior that most people are skilled in. But over time, that extra time that you spend up front will be like a lubricant that enables it to move faster, longer than it ever will before, because now you have a valuing of one another rather than a disagreement with one another. So I don't know if that's a acceptable answer, but I do. It comes down to emotional intelligence and knowing yourself. So.
I think it's a common thread throughout this year's talks is learning to listen to understand and not react, or the art of listening. A question I have: the more producers and the people I work with, it doesn't matter if I'm in a hog barn, poultry farm, poultry processing plant, feed mills. We have an issue with culture, I think, and we can't keep employees and we can't find employees. What do you think we need to start doing different in agriculture to get people to want to work with us and make it an environment for everybody could succeed in a traditionally very hierarchy, process oriented environment?
Yeah, this is Casey, you've asked the $1 million question here in agriculture, right? And I remember, I'm going to tell a small story before I answer it directly, but I mentioned that I went from PIC to this organization called Agribusiness Group. And in PIC, I was working with a lot of the integrators at that point, the early phases of integration that were going on in North Carolina and somewhat in Iowa. Sow farms were becoming bigger. Smaller ones were getting bought together and merged. And the employee base, most importantly, was becoming more non-agricultural. And these were the issues that most of the people on the farms were asking me when I was really just there to tell them how to put the insemination rod in and how to collect semen properly. And as a scientist, I hadn't gone to school for any of that, but I told you about all the activities that I had been a part of in college. Mm-hmm. And some of that was informing my opinion that there is a way to help people feel like they fit and they matter and that they belong. I didn't have a lot of what I would call education in it. I did have some experience, but I had enough wherewithal to know that there are probably some HR leaders out there that have experience with this. So we started bringing these programs in as part of our consulting projects with these sow farms to say, what would really help? And at that point, it might have been a book of SOPs just to help people know what to do when they got on the farm because they were coming with a non-agricultural background. And then it became, well, maybe we need to pay them a little bit more. So 10 cents an hour will mean a lot when they can go down the road rather than stay right here on this sow farm. And those things were helpful, but they never solved the problem. And that was 20 years ago, right? 25 years ago, to be exact. If we looked at that, and now we're still dealing with that, but it's on an exacerbated basis, right? Because we're even less agricultural than we did. At least then, someone remembered grandpa used to have a farm. Now it's my great grandpa or my great great grandpa used to have a farm. And so I think the piece of it is like those of us that grew up in agriculture have that passion and that conviction for the industry. Most people are not coming to work in agriculture because of that. They're coming to work for a paycheck. But most people, and this is a philosophy and a belief, but most people want to know that they're making a difference at what they do. The command and control leadership style doesn't allow that to happen. When I tell you what to do, then I know what needs to happen, but you don't know what needs to happen or why. And I think that's this pivot of leadership that will cause some of that culture shift to occur where people want to fit and want to matter and want to bring their best self to work. So a leader's biggest job is not to motivate their employees. A leader's biggest job is to create an environment where employees are motivated to do their best work every day. That small wording change causes a mindset change, which causes a skill set change to say, I no longer can tell you what to do. I have to help you foster independence and self-reliance to know how to get to the outcome, because the time that it takes for me to tell you what to do, something may have changed and what I'm telling you is no longer relevant. So I don't know if that matters, but I do think we're in a place where we've tried to do as much as we possibly can to reward and recognize and tell people that they matter. But now it really means that the leaders have to create a culture where people want to fit and want to matter. So.
Great point. Question from Jim Smith. How does a new professional graduate assert themselves when working with late Gen X or young boomer leadership?
Well, we're getting into a lot of categories and stereotypes with that question. So that's why I chuckled just a little bit, knowing how to answer that, right? There's probably some stereotypes that go between boomer leadership and Gen X leadership, but generally, if we were to look at that continuum that I put up there, right? Those leadership styles, I mean, in general, the boomers are going to be a little bit more like, hey, we had to figure it out. You have to figure it out too. The Gen Xers are probably going to be a little bit more like, we were latchkey kids. We got off the school bus and fixed our own snack, and mom and dad didn't come home from work until 6 o'clock, and I was home by myself. So I'm used to being by myself, and I had to figure it out. You figure it out. If we were to look at what is being termed as a young professional, people coming into the workplace today, and the way that I frame this up is, these are individuals who have never not had a coach or an authority figure beside them at all point. And it's because of my generation and the boomer generation, right? We put our kids in all of these crazy activities, from ballet to jazz to tap to piano to football to basketball to baseball, and they're doing all of that. But what that means is they've always had an adult professional standing beside them at some point, telling them what the standard of excellence looks like. You need to run this fast, jump this high, play the piano like this. Here's how you could get better. Here's some skills, here's some drills, here's some activities. And then we put them into a work environment and say, I don't know, I had to figure it out, you figure it out, right? Those are the same person is saying two very different messages. I'm telling my kids, you need to be under the guidance and leadership of somebody who knows how to do this better. And then I'm telling my employees, go figure it out. You just need to do it because I had to do it, right? So the young
I think the biggest parenting mistake, I don't know if it's parenting mistake or.
Yeah, we can dive into the cultural elements of that all we want, but I think the biggest thing that can happen here is a young professional needs to understand what they need, right? When they come into the work environment, if most people want to help, most people want to be of assistance. So if an employee comes in and says, hey, I'm really not understanding what I need to do, I would need a little more direction before I'd be able to go do this properly, right? Where could I go to get some direction? Asking those questions is a huge sign of leadership, right? But most people aren't going to do that because they feel like they're pointing out their ignorance. But in this environment, what you have to realize is we're all slightly ignorant because nobody's ever done it this way. I don't care how many years you've raised pigs. I don't care how many years you've raised chickens. I don't care how many years you planted corn. Nobody's ever done it in an environment like this that the world has just pivoted on its axis in the last 14 months. So maybe the science of putting a seed in the ground is exactly the same, but the way that we're doing it today is completely different. So I think the biggest mark of emotional intelligence is when someone says, this is what I need. And sometimes that means I need direction. And sometimes that means I just need a little more support. Like, it would feel really good right now if someone patted me on the back and said, your learning is meaningful, because it doesn't feel like I'm very productive yet, right? So a young professional, the way that they assert themselves, I think, is being able to ask for what they need to get their biggest goals and objectives accomplished, irrespective of what type of leadership you have around you, if it's boomer or Gen X or, an alien from Mars. So.
Good points. Any questions? I got some young leaders out here I'm going to call on. Wes, you have a question?
Sorry, I got a 2-year-old at home, so I've been kind of in and out. But kind of bringing it more towards like even parallels to like the sales process of the and or. It seems like it's so definite, black or white, that it doesn't always have to be that way.
Sure. I appreciate that, Wes. Can you iterate what your question is with that statement?
Not really a question in there, but just more of a statement, kind of going through it. And, we talked about you can't really show up one day and just, switch your whole mindset to this. Any ways that we can start small, I guess? Is there good things to try first before you really dive into it, or is it just best to dive in, feet first and go?
Yeah. Well, I hear that question too. You're asking like, what can I do? Right. And some of this is not about doing just yet as much as it is about being, right? So like, I think you just have to be okay with holding sometimes the tensions between things that seem opposite, right? Or when you catch yourself being so busy and you're just making decisions so quickly and you're not really thinking about that, what's happening in your brain is you're splitting those decisions into some of those more obvious situations. So if there is one thing that anyone can do is to be a little bit more reflective on their day in the beginning and probably at the end to say, where are those moments in time when I'm probably going to have to put a little white space in my calendar today because it's back to back to back to back? Or where are those moments in time when I can at least put my phone down and think about what's happening in the world, right? Or what's happening with me, or how did I show up in that interaction? But it's those periods of reflection that most leaders, most people don't give themselves the gift of because they believe they're too busy. And that's really one of the lies that goes on in people's head is I'm too busy to get better. So they just keep doing the same thing over and over and over. So I tell people, if it's the 10 minutes that you choose to go to the bathroom, right? Just don't take your phone and just be quiet in the bathroom. Like imagine that. What would happen if you had 10 minutes in the bathroom just to think rather than 10 minutes in the bathroom to scroll your phone? What would happen if the 5 minutes that it took you to brew your coffee in the morning, you sat back and you just thought about what your day was going to look like and where you needed to give yourself some white space? So to me, that's really where I would tell someone to get started, because that affects your being. It doesn't really affect your doing. And right now, doing isn't the problem. We just need a lot more leaders who know how to be, who know how to be and rather than do or. So
I'm going to go back to one of your slides where you put the bubbles together and instead of or and. A lot of times, at least in my career, it's always, family and career or work was or. It never could be and. And what suggestions do we have for, us to change that mind shift, especially in agriculture where everything's a fire and everything needs to be done today concept that we live in?
Yeah. Well, let me illustrate it with my story, Casey. I don't know if this is a dangerous thing for me to say I've got it figured out for everybody else, because everybody else's situation is going to be different, right? But I mean, there was a period of time in my life when I felt that same way. I told you I had 5 kids, so I just kept adding kids to the equation until I couldn't handle it anymore because there wasn't any more time or availability for me. And I was on an airplane traveling, or I was with customers all the time, but I really wasn't present even with my family when I was home, right? So there comes a point in time when that and is going to get formed one way or the other, right? It's going to be, you're going to figure this out or you're not, right? You're going to go a different direction. But the one thing that we're never going to be able to get back is time, right? The one thing that we're never going to be able to manufacture is more hours in the day. So it's how do we show up during those hours of the day that really matter. And in some cases, that dichotomy between where do I spend my time? Well, if we've learned anything in the last 14 months is like work and life have kind of just sandwiched all together. But I think if I go back to that continuum, I think this is where it also comes from, is in that industrial and mechanized age in the early days, what we had was a 9 to 5 mindset. Like you punched a clock when you came in and you punched a clock when you left. And we still sort of have that mindset even in today's environment. But what's happened is proliferation of information in the digital age has caused us to be able to take it with us anywhere we want. So it's not 9 to 5. But most people haven't quite figured out what is my best gift, right? Here's where the gift of time really you get to use it, is because I might be giving my time to things that's not my best gift. So maybe the best thing that you can do for yourself is to be able to say no to some of the stuff that isn't your best gift, so that you can say yes to the stuff that is your best gift. And that's where most people haven't quite lived or given themselves the freedom, because we're too busy doing to figure out what it is I am. And I always like to start there in the being part of this to help people say, well, what do you believe is your best gift? Where are you giving your time? Because what's happening today is you're giving your time to the things you believe are most important to you. You're in control of that. You may be doing it somewhat autonomically because the boss said this needed to get out, or the work needs to get done, or you're feeling like this and you need approval for it. So whatever means is you're doing that out of a matter of choice. But now how do you give yourself the power of choice to say, how do I dedicate my time to that brings me the best me? And sometimes what really comes out of that is I'm doing the wrong work. But that's hard for people to say because their identity is so enmeshed with the work that they're doing. So I don't know if that helps, Casey, but for me, one of my biggest reasons of stepping away from corporate America was because it wasn't my best gift. It wasn't the best thing that I could be doing. But 20 some odd plus years of identity wrapped up into that, it was really hard to kind of unravel that and say, I am not what I did. I am who I am. So.
Oh, good thoughts. Another thing, we still have to be driven on performance, right? Companies have to make money. How do we, with this newer generation, they are purpose driven. Companies are paid by results. How do you balance that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're never, I think I even had a side in there, right? Results or engagement. And that's the dichotomy that most companies want to put in there. Do we spend time doing all this soft, squishy stuff with people, or do we spend our time doing the stuff that's going to make us money, right? Well, that's false, because you can't make money without the people in your business. And if we're seeing anything right now, I don't know where it's coming from, and I'm not going to get into the politicization of it, but the labor shortage is a real thing right now. Whether or not it's because of will or skill, I don't know. But if we're seeing that happening, we have to make our environments a place where people want to come to work, because we have to help them feel like they fit or they matter. And if we step back, every business that is making money is generally making money because they're doing it for a purpose. Now, admittedly, there are some businesses out there that we could all argue maybe their purpose isn't noble, but it's meeting a need of some sort, right? Any business, and agriculture in specific, we have a very noble calling, right? But it's connecting that person's heart and mind with that noble calling and saying, how can you enable this to happen better, smarter, faster, smarter, cheaper? That's going to generate the company revenue, but the revenue is an output. It's not necessarily an input, and it's not an outcome. It happens as a result of us having high engagement and high environments where employees want to thrive and want to do their best. I guess secondarily, that's a soapbox that I also believe is like corporate America has exceeded their capacity, because what's happened in the past is we've just thrown people to the problem, and companies staff up, and when that problem goes away, they staff down. And that gives employees a feeling of constantly being in fear. Like, I don't know if I'm going to have a job. But if we do this right, and we build a culture where people fit and they matter, and they don't really worry about the boundaries of what my title says, but they're a leader at all level, and they go find problems that need solved and bring people along with them, we don't need more bodies. What we need is a better prioritization scheme so that they can say, I got to go tackle that problem because this problem over here isn't valuable anymore. But in the old hierarchy, I have to go get approval from my boss to say, I'm not going to do this project anymore, and I'm not going to work on this. And then that takes time away from actually solving the problem that's right in front of us today. And so that's why this more nimble, agile culture is a more important thing for us, because we gotta have people at all levels that know how to go solve the problem, irrespective of a hierarchy. And that means we won't need to constantly staff up and staff down, because we know we're teaching people how to learn and fix things rather than teaching them how to be a more technical, competent leader. So I don't know, you're going to get me really impassioned if we get on this topic very much longer. So.
Well, Beth has a different question. So how do you get past the asking for your needs to getting the help? I have, along with fellow graduate students, constantly pointing out issues we see and have experienced, but yet get pushback of this doesn't happen. And so how do you get help when no one is listening?
Well, I certainly don't want to diminish the severity of this question, because it sounds like just listening to it, it sounds like there's some trauma experiences in the past with repeated trying. So I don't want to diminish that, right? But you're not going to get your needs met until you ask for what you need. And you just got to keep doing it until your needs get met. So probably if I could put it into a phrase, a leader is anyone who can help you with your needs. It doesn't have to be the person that you report to or the person that's in charge of the work output that you're doing, right? So don't feel like you always have to go to the same source if that source isn't helping you. Now, there are times, hierarchical or leadership position or whatever it is, I do need to keep that person in the loop of what is happening with me. But when you feel stuck and your needs aren't being met, find someone who can help you with that. And I generally think that needs frame up into two categories. You have a need for direction, or you need to know what to do or where to go look for it or who to talk to. All of those are in direction, right? You might need even to understand what the goal is. You might need to even understand what the why is behind it. You might need to understand but those are usually needs for direction. Then there's another need that we have as a human that is a need for support, to know that we fit, that we matter, that we have feelings, that life comes in the middle of all this. And that support sometimes means I just need to be asked about my opinion, or sometimes that means I need a pat on the back, or sometimes that need for support means I need to hear myself talk about this. So I just need you to listen and point out maybe where my thinking is flawed, right? But if you feel like you only have one source to go to get that, and that source isn't meeting it, then I would just sit there and say, who is the leader that I need to go to get my needs met, irrespective of the position or hierarchy that person has to have.
I could tell you my direct supervisors hated that about me. If they didn't have the answer, I'd go find the answer, and sometimes they'd get upset.
Yeah, well, because generally what's happening at that point, Casey, is you're pointing out their incompetence. Because if they had the answer, they would have given it to you long ago. And when you're going to find it from someone else and you come back with the answer, they're like, okay, you just pointed out something that I didn't know and I wasn't able to do for myself. And it can be threatening for that type of a leader, but they're going to be reactive about it. They're not being creative about it. But what you're really doing is being a leader. So when someone asked that question earlier, how does a new employee show up? You show up by being a leader, irrespective of what type of leadership is demonstrated around you, right? You certainly don't want to be that leader who says, I don't know, you go figure it out, and then gets threatened because someone went and figured it out.
Thank you.
And for Beth, who asked the question too, I mean, there's probably so many aspects and so many different angles behind your question. I mean, truly, honestly, it sounds to me like this is an experience where a coach really would be able to help you process through what would you need to do to show up in that situation better or different than what you've already done, or where could you go to get the help that you need. I don't want to diminish that at all either, because your question is complex in so many different ways.
And I would say the last 14 months had put probably where her questions coming from even more strain on academia. I think there are some challenges there before, and I can say that from working in academia, but I think the last 14 months has probably heightened those issues, and not just academia, but probably in all companies. And so do you feel, you talk about a mindset shift and a change in leadership, do you feel that will be better? Is this just a temporary thing, or is this a massive problem of society that we have to, it's going to be taking some really creative thoughts and leadership to change?
Yeah, so I'm an eternal optimist, and I believe in the power of human choice. And I believe humans can always choose to make it better if they want to. But the question is if they want to, right? But again, I'm going to illustrate it with a story. If you would have told me 4 or 5 years ago that agriculture would be talking about carbon credits and the environmental impact, when people were just completely dismissing the environmental concerns that others had, I would have told you we would never get there, right? Or we're having a hard time. But look at look at agriculture in general, about how it's changing its mindset and changing some of the belief system behind it to also say, we're feeding the world, but we have to reach the people we're feeding first, right? So some of that gives me optimism to think that even in agriculture, our leadership can and will choose to change. Sometimes we might have to be forced into it, and other times we're going to be led into it, right? And I think that with the changing demographics of our industry, I do have optimism to say that the newer generations coming in are no longer going to tolerate the things that have happened in the past. They're no longer going to tolerate that command and control leadership style of saying, just do it my way. They're going to keep asking why. And when they keep asking why, it's going to cause the leader to have to answer that question for themselves, to say, well, I don't know why. And if I don't know why, I don't have a better answer for telling you we can't do it a different way. So let's go do it a different way. So if there's any admonition here, is to keep asking, just keep trying, because there are so many people who say we can't change. And that's not true. We all have the power to change, but sometimes people need to lead us there. So.
Well, I definitely think the younger generation will lead us to change. And I hope it leads us to where we can take down our barriers and be open to change.
Amen to that.
Any last minute thoughts, questions here? Well, if not, thank you, Jim. Great presentation. Like he said, he gave you guys a gift. You have an email, a phone number to reach out to him, and he's a great resource. And if you're looking networking too, right? Getting into some of these big corporations and things to know everyone. But it was really awesome. And just in closing, I will try, I won't promise that I'll get a survey out next week for feedback so we can start planning our next series of webinars. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Casey.